one of the biggest cause of co-founder conflict is speaking different languages. On the surface, you might be arguing about your go-to-market strategy, but what's actually going on under the surface is some unspoken resentment from a couple weeks ago that you haven't talked about. And so you're going in circles talking about go-to-market instead of getting into the root of the issue. A psychologist I used to work with, a mentor of mine, said, Matt, whenever you see a couple client and they come into your office and they're arguing about the dishes, it's not about the dishes. It's about something deeper going on. And if you can help them name that, then the dishes won't matter anymore. And I think largely 80-20, quite similar about business.
But yeah, it's usually, you're fighting about one thing, but it's usually about something else. And then you have to kind of have the tools to get down to that deeper layer. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Ignite podcast. Today we're thrilled to have Dr. Matthew Jones with us. Matt is a licensed psychologist turned startup co-founder coach. He spent the past 6 years working with hundreds of entrepreneurs on everything from burnout to co-founder conflict. He's a co-founder of Co-Founder Clarity, a firm that helps founding teams backed by firms like YC, Sequoia, and A16Z communicate better, build trust, and scale more resiliently. His work has been featured in Time, Business Insider, and Inc., and he's about to release a new book this summer, The Co-Founder Effect, which I've read a little bit of. Thanks for sending that over, by the way. So we're going to deep dive today into the psychology behind co-founder relationships and what makes or breaks founding teams. So thanks for coming on, Matt.
Thank you, Brian. I'm really excited to chat.
Yeah. No, thanks for getting in touch. And, I'd love to understand what first led you from clinical psychology into the world of startups, and in particular VC-backed founders.
Sure. While I was getting my doctorate in clinical psychology, two of my closest friends started a company together, and I watched them go through all the entrepreneurial ups and downs, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But among those, there was a lot of venting. So a good friend of mine, Cole, would come to me and be like, Matt, Drew's driving me nuts. He's really pessimistic. He's not seeing the bigger picture here. Likewise, Drew would come to me and say, Cole's driving me nuts. He's relentlessly optimistic and isn't being realistic and practical about our situation. And at a certain point, I was like, look, guys, the problem's not internal. It's not that one of you is right and one of you is wrong. It's an interpersonal issue. So let's sit down and talk as a team. So fast forward a little bit. They found it immensely beneficial. I was instantly hooked. And years later, they said, Matt, you not only saved our business, you saved our friendship too. And so that's what introduced me to this world of co-founder coaching more generally.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. As I read the book, I've read some, I've been married 20 years, so I've definitely read some books on relationships, and, there's lots of corollaries. Maybe you could talk about what were some of the things that you found to be exactly the same, and maybe some of the things that surprised you and you found different, counseling couples versus, the other kind of couple, startup couples.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I did do a good amount of couples therapy before working with co-founding teams. And so I saw a lot of different ways that marriages work and don't work. And part of what was so fascinating to me was seeing the similarities where at the end of the day, and I know a lot of founders will joke about kind of being married to their co-founder, because the truth is you do spend at times more hours of the day with this person than your significant other. You compound that over years, there is a deep relationship. And that's part of the argument I make in the book, is that regardless of what you want to call it, it's fundamentally an attachment-based relationship, meaning that your attachment pattern, your internal dynamics and some of the interpersonal BS that we all have, by the way, is going to show up in this relationship. And so it gives you a beautiful opportunity to work through it. And hopefully you take advantage of that opportunity, both for personal and professional growth and for the well-being of the company. But to your question, I think part of what stood out initially was, wow, all these different theories and modalities that I've learned about in psychology, the Gottman work, emotion-focused couples therapy, Imago, like relational psychoanalysis, like all this nerdy stuff applies in this relationship and no one else sees it. I was like, wait, how is it that the most important relationship in business is the most under-researched? How is it that people are okay with 65% of co-founders failing due to conflict, but we're not actually giving them resources and tools that we know for decades are helpful in this other situation? And so immediately I was struck by the parallels.
Yeah, it's interesting. You said 65%. And, I think in my own anecdotal experience, and don't quote me on this, or, maybe you have the data on this, but I've noticed with my startup failures, I'd say at least half, maybe 2/3 of the time, it is one co-founder leaving the other, right? They're, for a variety of reasons. Could be interpersonal conflict, could be I just, I need a more stable, high paying job, or, hey, I don't believe this is going to scale. But it's usually, hey, one of the co-founders leaves, and then it's hard for that single co-founder to survive on their own.
100%. And that's, you're speaking as well to, and this is part of the difference between a marriage and a co-founding team, is that things like degrees of sacrifice, how much time, energy, effort, financial runway, emotional runway you have to give to a startup. And then the focus on, we still have a company to build. We have to perform, or we don't have a company tomorrow. Some of those pressures, I think, are unique to co-founders. That's not necessarily the same in marriage, where we might be thinking more about satisfaction, happiness, well-being, some of those other dimensions. Here, if you don't perform, you don't get to continue building. And so I think that that's an important point as well.
Yeah. So let's talk about the co-founder effect. What is that, and why does it matter so much?
So yeah, a few different things here. One, this is the title of my book. And so it is now available for pre-sale. And I think it's actually going to launch here on July 23rd. So I'm pretty amped about that. The co-founder effect is a unique way of describing.
Well, this episode will definitely come out after you launch, so probably 2 to 3 weeks. Yeah, we're recording on July 15th. If anybody's keeping score here.
Awesome. So then, so it'll be out in the world. And the reason I named it this is because as I was looking both through all my clinical experience working with teams, but then also looking at adjacent fields. So looking at marital kind of research and what those outcomes suggest. As I was looking at, a lot of like Dr. Freeman's work on founder mental health and sort of what that research says. More or less what really started to come clear to me, and I explain this in the book as the co-founder conflict impact matrix, which is not a sexy name, but it is straightforward. It's just a nice little matrix that explains the complex dynamics of co-founding teams and how it impacts personal well-being, professional well-being, kind of the collective team, the culture of the company. And so to me, I named the co-founder effect to try to articulate this, that there's no other relationship in business that is both an existential threat to its existence and is responsible for its success. And that's what I believe is unique about this relationship compared to all others.
So what do you think gets overlooked during early stage fundraising and company formation? It seems, I do a lot of YC investing. It seems that all the YC teams typically have long histories together, at least work history. If not, they've been friends since high school or college. Why do you think a lot of co-founders overlook that importance? And very successful firms like YC, really lean on that.
There's a couple different threads that I want to pull on in what you just asked. One, I think part of why YC emphasizes co-founders, I know like there's different ways of thinking about this, right? Like Noam Wasserman's research, who wrote The Founder's Dilemmas, gets into the ways in which, kind of from a resource perspective and what you can bring into a startup, it's beneficial to have two founders or more. And putting aside the complementary skill sets and all the rest of the standard stuff, part of what I think YC has discovered over a long time of doing this is that this same co-founder effect that can work in a very negative way also works in a positive way. So the synergistic interaction where it becomes a negative, where you're burned out emotionally and things are going wrong with your co-founder, and it just kind of eats away at the foundation of operating and makes it 10 times harder. It can make it 10 times better whenever you're in lockstep, you feel completely aligned, you're rowing the same direction with the same cadence, the same energy and enthusiasm. And so I think that they also understand that upside and perhaps understand that there can be a buffer there as well.
What do you think gets overlooked during early stage company formation?
Right.
Founders are sort of starting out, like what kind of like early dysfunctions do you see? And then we'll kind of get into the, post formation dysfunction.
Yeah, I dig that. I guess, one thing that came up, because you mentioned as well the aspect of founding with friends. You said a lot of co-founders have known each other for quite some time. I think one issue that I see pertaining to that is actually overlooking the ways in which that can be a risk and not a benefit. And so what I mean is Noam Wasserman's research does point out that teams who are founded with friends are more unstable than those founded by strangers. And the reason being is because this multiple relationship actually leads at times to more avoidance, because it becomes a very tricky catch-22 where someone is worried, oh, if I give this negative professional feedback, I might be hurting and damaging my friend in this personal side. And so it leads them to kind of bypass that responsibility that you would with any other team member to give them feedback. And so that can lead to resentment, that can lead to internalized frustration and then a major blow up. It actually makes things so much worse. And so I think for friends turned co-founders, it's really important to pay attention and stress test the relationship with small projects right away, with giving each other difficult feedback and being really clear about your prioritization of, are we going to, if everything goes to shit here. Are we going to prioritize the relationship or our friendship, or are we going to prioritize the business? And being clear about that from day one, I think, is a really important factor.
No, that's a really good conversation to have. And I would say, I don't know how, again, I don't have the stats. This is anecdotal for YC startups. I'd say most of them lean on work experience together, which tends to be kind of a friendly professional relationship, right? And so you're kind of used to working with that person in a professional context. But, you do see the teams together. What are, switching to talk about kind of some of the common founder dysfunctions in your coaching experience, what are maybe the 2 or 3 most common psychological patterns that cause co-founder conflict?
What I'd love to start with is thinking about and defining co-founder conflict, because I think that's also another piece here that gets overlooked. And that's part of what I try to describe in the book, which is I don't think conflict is as simple as a disagreement. I think it's something a little bit more systemic, recurring, and challenging. And so whenever I talk about co-founder conflict, what I'm fundamentally talking about is relational conflict. So it goes beyond strategy and tactics. And so then there's an emotional buildup that impacts one or more team members. And the reason I say that is I think some healthy disagreement is really important for a business. And so I don't want to say all disagreement is a conflict, but putting that aside and looking then just specifically at these relational disagreements where there is some frustration or whatever resentment that builds up, I think within that, there's a few different ways that we can talk about it. One is just briefly introducing the 3 languages that all teams speak. So I'm going to give you a framework to think about kind of what I think is a root cause here. So there's 3 languages all teams speak. There's operational, psychological, and archetypal. Operational language is the language of business. This is the default setting, focusing on KPIs, ROAS, like whatever else. And it requires a certain mode of operating. And that mode of operating is straightforward. It's trying to be more or less kind of serious, not necessarily focused on a lot of extraneous variables, not reading too deep into things. It's just focusing on content rather than process, let's say. Psychological language is the language of emotion. It's internally, how am I feeling? It's internally, how are you feeling? And then how are we feeling as we're working together? To be effective at using psychological language, it requires slowing down. It requires asking more questions, a little bit more spaciousness, a little bit of curiosity about what's going on in your head. And so a lot of the work, you could kind of summarize it is me helping teams go from operational down to psychological language to debug and realign and go make sure that the business is on the same page. But the last piece here to kind of round this out and then make the point is the language of the unconscious. And so that is archetypal language. And so the reason I call it the language of the unconscious is that this is the vibe. It's the unspoken feeling whenever you are in relationship with someone. And you know this, like you've been married 20 years. There's some moments you walk in and you're like, oh, something's not right. Something doesn't feel right in the room. I don't know if it's eggshells. I don't know if it's like some frustration coming over from there or from here, but there's something going on. And I think that feeling is actually a really important communication about the status and health of the relationship. And so same with co-founding teams. And so I break this down in such a way to basically say this. One of the biggest causes of co-founder conflict is speaking different languages. On the surface, you might be arguing about your go-to-market strategy. But what's actually going on under the surface is some unspoken resentment from a couple weeks ago that you haven't talked about. And so you're going in circles talking about go-to-market instead of getting into the root of the issue. A psychologist I used to work with, a mentor of mine, said, Matt, whenever you see a couple client and they come into your office and they're arguing about the dishes, it's not about the dishes. It's about something deeper going on. And if you can help them name that, then the dishes won't matter anymore. And I think largely 80-20, quite similar about business.
But yeah, it's usually, you're fighting about one thing, but it's usually about something else. And then you have to kind of have the tools to get down to that deeper layer. So how can founders be more aware of these before it's too late, besides reading your book?
Well, let me also go back to what you were, because there was the second part, which is like, I want to give you if we say it's not about the dishes, let me also just say a few things about what it can be. It can be much like a marriage. It can be arguments about closeness. Do I feel like you have my back whenever I need you? If I'm late at night pushing code, are you going to be there in the morning to review or whatever? Like if I have an investor meeting tomorrow and I really need feedback and I give you a ring at 1:00, are you going to answer? Like some of those degrees of closeness really matter. Same with recognition. Do I feel seen and appreciated in my work and in my contribution? Or do I feel like I'm being taken for granted and overlooked? And are we actually fighting because I think I'm putting in 100% and the exact same amount of effort and time as you, and you think I'm just slacking off and kind of hanging out? That's a problem. And I see that all the time. And so there's different themes that we can argue about. But at the root, I would say it's all about trying to figure out what is the elephant in the room that we're not articulating yet? And can we face that with courage? And then to your point about the book, with an adequate tool belt, a skill set to do that in an effective and productive manner.
Have you dealt with disagreements on equity splits? How do you usually handle those? I mean, I'm
All
guessing
day,
that comes up a lot.
100%.
Yeah.
And I see that largely like pre-seed, I would say pre-seed and seed mainly, but that's just a generalization.
Right, because I can imagine a fight erupting where it's like, well, yeah, I only have 20% of the company and you have, 50 or 60 or 40, whatever it is. And there's a couple other co-founders maybe that have, 5 or 10 or 15. And it's just like, well, yeah, you should be working harder. You have, the majority of the company, right? Like, how do you handle those disagreements? That's an interesting one.
100%. Another interesting one is like 50-50, but unequal contributions. Yeah. So
that's a little tougher. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a little tougher because now I'm working 12, 14-hour days and I see you working 7, 8-hour days. But I have kids, and you don't, and stuff like that.
100%. And that's the other thing to your point about children. Like there are life circumstances where I think equity agreements should be renegotiated. So I think about equity not just as a number, but as a symbol for that degree of investment, sacrifice, contribution, et cetera, both historically, presently, and looking into the future. And so part of the way I view my job in that is to have these conversations, both to unpack that emotional issue that's happening. And then as we feel seen and heard and understood in that component, then let's say, okay, we've just checked off psychological and archetypal language. Let's go back up now to operational. Now, do we still feel like we need to make an adjustment? And can we do that professionally and in a way that makes sense for everybody and for the company as well? Because ultimately, it's not in the best interest of the company for one person, in this case, let's say 50-50, but completely opposite contributions. I don't think that's a good tone for anybody.
Right.
And so
it's time to open that cap table discussion and revisit it now that we're 6, 12, 18 months down the line, and we know where each other are at with the contribution and how we might want to resplit it.
100%. And so oftentimes it's having, it's me facilitating some of those dialogues. The point I was bringing up about the transition is, and this should change over time, right? Because if you have kids and I don't, and all of a sudden, literally you don't sleep as much as me, you're busy changing diapers, doing these other things, or other people will have health concerns that come up or other life-altering circumstances, I think we should be able to be flexible here. And we need to then, on both sides, work together to name that imbalance and then correct it as needed in the operational piece.
Nice. So let's talk about attachment styles. You've talked about this playing out in startup teams. How do these show up and what's the impact? And maybe you could give a, for the listener who doesn't know what that means, what is an attachment style? How does it manifest? What are the different types and what are the kind of the conflicts? I actually know a little bit about this because I did read this in a book. So I'm anxious to hear how it kind of applies to startups.
Cool. Yeah. So what I was saying before is that fundamentally your attachment style will show up in this relationship because it is a deep, meaningful relationship that exists over time and you go through a whole lot of high stress things together. And so attachment is kind of like a way of thinking about it. And, the book will break this down in more detail. I'm just going to kind of give hopefully something that feels a little bit more accessible, is that we all have needs for responsiveness, for security, and feeling like someone is available to us. And so at a deep psychological way, that shows up for babies and infants, and it shows up for us as adults. And so within the context of this relationship, there's several different attachment patterns that tend to show up over and over again, just like, by the way, it does in marital research and couples therapy. And so one of the most common and at times frustrating ones is called a pursue-withdraw dynamic. And this comes from emotion-focused couples therapy, Sue Johnson's work. And part of what this shows is that one person might feel anxious and or frustrated and tends to pursue, and you might just think about that as criticize the other person. So, hey, you're not pulling your weight. I feel like you're mismanaging this, et cetera. So making these statements.
As more of a conflict style, we'll bring it up, would rather talk about it and fight about it. Right?
100%. Because under the surface, so that's like what it looks like on the surface. Under it, what's actually happening is a lot of anxiety. Hey, I feel like all the responsibilities on my plate and I need help. Hey, I feel really scared that if you don't do this, we're going to fail, right? And so it's then manifesting as criticism. What that does to the other person, though, if they have like a withdraw type of attachment style, like an anxious avoidant, is actually to kind of pull back. So they'll pull back and they'll say, oh, like, I feel like I can't win here. I feel like nothing I do is right. I feel like no matter what I do, you're going to find a complaint. And so instead of like trying to be proactive in my communication, I'm going to pull back and just try to stay in my lane and focus on what I have to get done because I'm already overwhelmed, by the way. And part of what's happening under their surface is this feeling of, maybe even if you could want to take it there, as far as like powerlessness. Like there's nothing they can do that's right. And that feels really suffocating. And so they're trying to get away from it. And so the problem though with this pursue and withdraw dynamic is that those positions just amplify. It's cyclical. It's not that like one person who's criticizing is in the wrong or that one person who's pulling away is in the wrong. It's actually that the way that the pieces fit together, it creates this dynamic where it amplifies distance over time and the conflict. And so it ends up being really unproductive. And so the good news is this is not rocket science. This is not like some new science that we have to invent. We know exactly what to do in order to get back on the same page, which to put really succinctly is that the person who's more of that, anxious, preoccupied attachment style, the criticizer, the one that we're calling the pursuer, they need to kind of relax a little bit, soften their delivery, try to focus and state more clearly what their emotional needs are, not what they are demanding the other person to do, that kind of thing. And then the person on the other side who's pulling away needs to try to lean in a little bit more and share a little bit more about what's happening for them and how they're impacted by some of the criticism. And then that starts to reshape the feedback mechanism that can lead to more productive dialogue.
So imagine you have a married couple and they have some level of dysfunction, let's call it level 7. And then you have a founding team, 2 co-founders. They also have an equivalent amount of dysfunction, level 7, let's call it. So equivalent dysfunction, equivalent level of dysfunction. Which couple is more savable in your mind?
More savable?
Yeah. Or are they equally savable or reconcilable? Or founder is easier to work with because it's more of they take a professional mindset and they're like, okay, growth mindset, I need to really improve here. Or are marriages, like they take things more personally? And they're less savable because of that, right?
It's a really good question. No, it's a dope question. I'm thinking about it. I think what comes to mind, and this might be a cop-out, so call me on it if this is BS. What comes to mind is if both are equally committed, both of them are 7 out of 10 dysfunction, and both of them take the actionable steps to improve how they communicate. Let's just start there. Let's say that they're able to clean up their communication, because that'd be step 1. So if we can...
They're both equally willing to work. I'm just talking about all the interpersonal dynamics of a couple versus all the interpersonal dynamics of a founding team. Do you find like I can be more successful with the founding team than I can with an equally dysfunctional like marriage? Or is it about the same?
I would actually say it's about the same. And I would say that...
Interesting.
And I think part of what is really interesting is I've been wrong on both accounts. I've had people come into the office and I'm like, y'all need to break up immediately. This is doomed or whatever the case may be. And they'll prove me wrong. We'll work through the process. And then they will actually come out the other side stronger. And I'm like, wow, incredible work. Like, I can't believe you guys did this while building a company. I'll have couples come in and I'm like, okay, like you guys are for sure staying together. Yeah, there's a little bit of dysfunction, but this is like well within normal. And then they will end it. And so what I've learned is actually the degree of emotional tolerance for what this dysfunction, what they're able to tolerate. You say 7 out of 10. For some people, like your 7 out of 10 is for them, that's 10 out of 10. So they're done. And so as I recalibrate with each person I'm working with, part of what's fascinating is seeing that where there are some teams that I work with today where they're yelling, they're screaming, and it's like, oh my gosh, this is so dysfunctional, you guys. And yet they're all in, they're committed to the process, they're working on making changes. And I've seen that work out. And I've seen other teams with much less outward intensity where one of them calls it after 6 months of working together. We're like, you know what, Matt, I think I've realized I'm actually done. And this whole time I've been done. And I'm like, whoa, I can't believe that. You have a great business. It seems like you guys actually fit in so many different fundamental ways, and yet you're emotionally done. And so I think that's also part of what's really challenging whenever people come to me more on the later stage of wanting to break up, right? Because they'll come to me and they'll ask Matt, like, more or less, I want you to advise us and tell us, should we stay together or should we not? And it makes it so difficult because, again, that where you draw that threshold in line is different and it's completely individualized and personal. So there's some businesses where I can look at them and say, hey, look, for various reasons, I don't think this makes sense. And they may choose to work it out and be successful. I mean, it's kind of remarkable, I think, the resilience of relationships.
Yeah, that sounds fascinating. Let's talk about burnout. What are some early signs you look for in diagnosing burnout in these high-performing founders? And, I can imagine sometimes you get founders that find you or get introduced to you and you're just like, hey, you guys are actually just burnt out. So it's hard to be emotionally resilient and, emotionally available and not have an avoidance kind of attachment. Like how do you kind of discern the difference between, hey, you guys have this dysfunctional conflict avoidance attachment style thing that's cycling, or maybe you guys are just burnt out and working too hard?
I view these as all interrelated components and not saying that if we fix one, that doesn't necessarily mean everything else is fixed. And so in my mind, actually, to make progress, we need to address all these different factors. So individual and personal well-being, kind of managing burnout, managing the relationship, making sure that the business, there's, tactical and strategic alignment. All of these are just different components that we need to focus on within co-founder coaching to get it right. What I will say though is, surprisingly, most founders that I work with who are burned out, I don't have to guess. They'll tell me, straight up, Matt, I'm so burned out, like I can't even do this right now, etc. The thing that's more challenging to me is not diagnosing who's burned out and who's not. It's addressing the burnout in a productive way. Because most founders, as you know, there's so much pressure, especially VC-backed founders. There's so much pressure to keep it together, to keep pushing forward, and maybe the team's still relying on them because they haven't leveled up. They're still kind of doing some IC work or whatever the case may be. There's this inflection point where they may be incredibly burned out, and what they need, and I just had this conversation last week with a founder, what he needs is 2 weeks off. He said, Matt, if I could get 2 weeks off, I think I would be, not 100%, but I would be 80% reset. But that would be me disconnecting my phone completely off grid, except for like an existential emergency. And yet I know that at absolute most I could do a week, and that's not going to really dig into what I have. But I know like the compounding effect of 2 weeks, it'd be really, really beneficial. And so I really empathize with that because it's far more challenging to figure out that piece, I think, than some of the others. And so I don't really have a good answer because I honestly haven't figured it out. I haven't, there's certain cognitive distortions or whatever we can talk about, but ultimately I've not found an easy solution to taking time away from your company.
Yeah. I mean, can you recover from burnout without a 2 or 3 week complete off the grid reset? Is it kind of like, hey, you can evaluate, hey, maybe working 12 to 14 hour days, 6-7 days a week is too much? Is there an amount that you kind of counsel these founders to pull back and say, hey, what's the sustainable amount where you just don't feel the burnout? Because I feel this as a solo GP at Team Ignite, right? I mean, we have Team Ignite, it's thousands of people and hundreds of startups and all this stuff, but it's me, it's basically me in Gmail all day on Zoom all day and, working 10, 12-hour days, 6-7 days a week. And I feel the burnout. So I'm kind of asking for myself too, is, how do I know I need to pull back a bit, and how do I create a sustainable path forward as a founder, right? Both for me and for my founders on Team Ignite.
Yeah. Well, let me address you first since I'm talking to you directly. I think part of what I was hearing was to say, like, you are burned out. You're already at that point.
Yeah. I'm feeling it, but I could still keep going. I just need to sort of find a sustainable path, Part of it is, I think when it's your thing, it's hard to turn off. It was easy when I was at big tech and it was like, nope, 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, I'm going home. Bye. See you tomorrow, and now it's like, nope, I gotta, all these people are waiting on me. All these founders, all the people, my LPs, they're all counting on me. Right. So I gotta actually the podcast is a way to actually create a space where I just get to chillax with somebody and talk about stuff. If I didn't have the podcast, maybe I'd even be more burnt out. I don't think the podcast is always for me, like, creates energy. I came in today pretty like, I don't know, not burned out, but just exhausted. I got a lot of stuff going on. We talked about it with my computer and stuff, and it's just like annoying. And yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that. How do you create a sustainable work life? And it seems to be around 50 hours. I really think it's about 50 hours is the sustainable amount, because beyond that, you just do start taking, withdrawals from your future energy bank account, from your sanity,
Yeah, I dig that.
Yeah. How do you think about all that?
I mean, I largely agree. And, the fact that you said, and I'm going to use my own terminology here, you came in today a little crispy, is an indicator that you need to pull back. And so can you be honest with yourself and then actually take the leap of faith that is required? Because to your point, walking away from your work has consequences. And whenever you're the biggest bottleneck in your company and everyone's coming to you and you see that mirrored to you, like, oh shit, like 10 people are waiting on me and I have these pressures to deliver and all this stuff. Walking away requires so much more courage than it does if you're in big tech and you can just kind of skate by. And so I think it really, to me, and I'm curious to hear your take on this, to me, I think there is an element here of self-trust. Do I trust that I can step away, prioritize these other values that I do genuinely care about, and continue to show up for these other people in my life and perform? At least for me, whenever I ask myself this question, there's moments where I don't feel like I can. And the pressure gets to me and I'm like, okay, I'm going to push forward. but I have young kids. And so what I notice is if I'm doing a whole lot of like late nights, that shows up in my parenting. I become a little bit of an asshole. I become a little bit less patient. And whenever I see that impact, it's an instant feedback mechanism for me where I'm like, okay, actually, tonight I need to take off. I need to reset. And so to your point, I think it might be ideal to develop that sustainable habit and routine, but also can we listen to those cues that we feel ourselves and that we see reflected to us in our environment and adjust accordingly.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about scaling partnerships. You said somewhere that what got you from 0 to 1 will break you from 1 to 100. What does that mean in the context of co-founder relationships and communication?
Yeah, I think what I mean is I see a lot of co-founding teams who will haphazardly kind of put together a partnership because they know each other, they work together, they're really excited about an idea, they see it's getting traction. And so then they'll start just informally, not pre-test the relationship, not be really conscious and explicit and intentional with their like questions around like things like value, sacrifice, exit, ideals, timelines, etc. And then they will construct a partnership where then all of a sudden there's this kind of inflection point where the company starts doing a bit better. And all of a sudden, a lot of things have to change. And the way that they operated as individual contributors has to level up to working as managers and then leaders and executives. And in that transition, which I just lumped together, even though it's actually, can be spread out, part of what is challenging is the feeling of we want to recapture the old days. We want to just kind of get back to the metaphorical garage together. When in fact, those old days, they're not coming back. Right? We have to actually create systems and processes to help you maintain alignment now that you didn't have to do before. And whereas before, if it's just relying on you, there can be this really close kind of, from a psychological perspective, more of like an enmeshed way of working together, and that can work really well early on. It's kind of like founder mode, but it makes absolute sense at that stage, and everyone and like the two co-founders are both doing it together. I see that over time demands some sort of recognition or change, where one of them might have to step more into a management leadership role. The other one, even if they continue to IC, there just has to be a way that the relationship evolves as you scale, rather than trying to just recapture what was the case.
That's really interesting. Most of these founders are avoiding hard conversations, or most people do too. Like, what are some tools and frameworks that you use to turn conflict into progress?
I'm going to give you the simplest, highest leverage tool that I've seen. Most arguments and difficult conversations are rushed. They sometimes happen at inopportune times because we've let some stuff build up. And so one is trying to make sure that we have a proper container. So we've agreed upon the time and space to have the conversation. That could be really simple. It could be me saying, hey, Brian, listen, the other day in our all hands, you interrupted me 3 times. I just want to chat about that on Friday at 2. Are you open to that? Great. Okay, so I put it on the calendar. So what I just did is I contained it. So now I gave it a name, a spot. You know that we're going to talk about this. I know that it's going to be talked about. I'm not going to build some resentment or whatever that's going to show up later. And then we can have that conversation. So one, that's kind of creating a container.
Yeah, you kind of put a label on it. You put a time and a place, and you kind of like, now I'm prepared. You've already kind of prepped me like, hey, I'm going to get some feedback and I'm going to have to discuss this thing in a few days on Friday.
Yeah, and I could be
I'm thinking about it too. And now when we get into that meeting, it's like we both thought about it too. It's not like a surprise.
Exactly. Like at worst, we've just both done some little unconscious processing that's going to help us in the moment. At best, we may have reflected. You may have said, oh, like, I didn't realize I did that. Like, let me think about it. And
in the 3 days that passed since Tuesday, I realized I interrupted a bunch of people, just like I just interrupted you on the podcast. But
yeah, exactly. And so then we can enter the conversation and have it. And there's specific kind of framing conversations that I get into in the book in more detail, but the exercise that I want to spend the most time on is just reflective dialogue. Reflective dialogue is when we take turns between a listener and the person speaking. And so in this case, let's just say I'm going to be the speaker, you're going to be the listener. And so I will share my message to the best of my ability using the old school iMessage. I felt X when you Y. What I need is Z, maybe if we're feeling spicy. And I'm going to try to stay on my side of the net. So I'm not going to say, Brian, like, you're controlling or whatever. I'm going to say, I felt controlled, right? Or whatever. So I'm rooting it on my side of the net using the I language. And then your job as the listener is just going to be repeat back what I said. So you're going to be like, okay, Matt, I heard you say that you felt controlled whenever I interrupted you those 3 times, and that your request is that we try to sync 5 minutes before the next all hands to make sure that we're completely aligned and we can present that shared alignment to the rest of the team. Okay. And so as you repeat it back to me, then I feel heard. I feel like Brian gets it. And that's fantastic. And so then you would repeat back and just ask me, Matt, did I get that right? Or is there more you'd like to add? And then I would kind of share a little bit more, and you just repeat this process until I feel completely heard and understood in my perspective. And then we would switch. And then you would have the opportunity to say anything to me. And then I would just reflect that back to you until you feel like I fully understand your perspective. And then often, if you do this a couple different rounds, both people will feel heard and understood. There's no need to interrupt. There's no need to escalate. You're not interjecting whenever you're listening. You're not interjecting your own commentary. You're not saying, oh, like, yeah, you said this, but I think this. You're just keeping it completely focused on the other person and then sharing all of your rebuttals, all of your internal dialogue, or whatever the case may be afterwards. And if you separate it out and you add this kind of structure, it ends up, it's like I think Imago, this comes from Imago dialogue. And what they talk about is this is the long road that makes the whole trip shorter. So it feels like a lot of upfront work. It feels kind of at times confining because you're following a specific process and procedure, but it actually saves so much time because there's so much less emotional activation that takes place. And so all the communication is much clearer.
So let's talk about a little bit, how can founders proactively, besides the communication skills, besides, that technique, what are some other proactive ways to prevent a messy co-founder breakup just generally?
I think every co-founding team needs to have a few different systems in place to help their relationship scale alongside their company. The two that I like to talk about are co-founder syncs and co-founder dates. And I named these co-founder syncs because it's focused on operational language and the happenings in the business to make sure that we're on the same page. I call it co-founder dates because some of my clients were like, Matt, this sounds a lot like a date. I'm like, you know what? I guess it kind of is. It's focusing back on the relationship. It's really focused on meta communication, talking about how we communicate with one another. Because that's the reflective space that most founders won't ever prioritize because we all know there's so many other things to be focused on. And so I think I recommend syncs. I see this every daily to weekly on various cadences, depending on stage and whatever's happening in the business. And so the main focus there is, again, just kind of reviewing what's happening, what's top of mind, who needs support, et cetera, just aligning on priorities. The dates are a little bit more involved. And so these focus, you might think of this more of like an hour or an hour and a half type of container. And this is really focused on, again, the relationship. So the main question to ask is, how are we doing? Not the business. How are we doing as we're working together? What's working well? What's not? Did you have anything emotionally come up that kind of might have contributed to some emotional debt on your side that we need to pay off today? The whole focus is reconnecting as individuals. And so that can also show up. Some teams that I work with love to do like long walks where they'll have some of these dialogues. Others exercise together. Others play music, video games. Like I've kind of seen it all. It's finding a set aside time and space to focus on the relationship to make sure that it continues evolving in a healthy way.
Let's wrap up with a rapid fire. What's one trait you consistently see in great co-founder duos?
I think that it's honestly a really hard question because I talked to a coach about this recently. I know this isn't fully rapid fire. Talked to a coach about this recently where we said that there's
rapidish fire. It's totally fine.
Okay, cool. That there's certain failure modes that we see in founders and co-founding teams that follow distinct patterns. But on the flip side of what works well, we've actually seen like a much wider breadth of what can work well. And so it's really about finding what it is for the team. But broadly, I would say a high commitment, excellent communication, and a complete alignment with the amount of emotional and time investment into the work.
What's a subtle behavior that always signals trouble between founders?
Avoidance.
One myth about founder mental health you'd love to bust.
I think the myth that founder mental health is kind of all on your shoulders and is a personal problem and not an organizational one. I think that founder mental well-being, especially within the context of co-founding teams, is one of the most underestimated relationships that can buffer your exposure to some of those highs and lows.
What's a common mistake VCs make when assessing founder dynamics?
Prioritizing expertise and skill set fit over emotional fit.
How do you assess that better as a VC? A lot of times I just meet like one of the founders. Sometimes they both come or all three come. And I usually give advice like, hey, this is a waste of your time. Just bring one. Like, how do I assess that? Granted, I'm not a lead investor. I'm not writing huge checks and sitting on the board. So I'm not gonna go take them out to dinner and spend a bunch of time. From my perspective, how do I assess those co-founder dynamics besides relying on the heuristics of, oh, okay, you guys worked at, Facebook together. Cool.
It's a hard question. I think VCs are in a hard place because you're idealized. And so you're not going to be told the truth and everyone's putting their best foot forward. And so it makes the signal to noise even more challenging to sort through. And so I think what I would brainstorm are certain questions that might reveal tension. And so I don't actually have a complete answer, but that's like the unformulated thought that's coming.
Yeah, I have a series of questions I ask. It is a difficult task, right? Because you're doing it over Zoom. They could be hundreds, thousands of miles away. So yeah, it's tough. Do you think solo founders are at an advantage or disadvantage psychologically?
Both. They have the advantage of not dealing with a potential existential risk to their company, but they lose that on the synergistic upside as well.
What's the most impactful co-founder ritual you've seen work at scale? You mentioned a couple, but like, what's the most impactful?
Honestly, it's going to be, it would kind of fit within the subcategory of dates, but it's the time together outside of work, doing something that you both enjoy.
Which startup ecosystem outside of SF and maybe New York City is doing culture right? Like, do you see differences in Miami startup scene versus Austin versus Seattle versus Europe versus, wherever else in the world? Which one do you see cultural differences in the relationships of founders around the country and the world?
I do. So I chat with a lot of executive coaches broadly and internationally, and several who are taking more interest in working with co-founding teams. And it does seem like there are cross-cultural differences in expectations. Where I thought the question was going is kind of locally, like what city is kind of doing it right now. I was going to plug Boulder and Denver because I'm local, and we're into conscious entrepreneurship out here and trying to focus on kind of the
it's a good culture there.
Yeah. So that's part of it, but I want to think more about the cross-cultural one because I don't have answers for you right now, but it's a very interesting question.
Yeah. I mean, there's different societies have different cultural needs, community first and kind of the Asian cultures versus, individualism in the Western cultures and stuff like that. And then Europe's probably some blend of that. And then you have all kinds of different cultural norms, even at the country level. It's a fascinating, look at it. And I wonder if there's maybe somebody can pull up the stats and comment on the episode or post about, are there co-founder divorce rates? How do they differ in different parts of the country or world? I wonder.
I'll also add to that really quick, if you don't mind. The divorce rate thing is fascinating. It's, again, so under-researched that most people rely on that Noam Wasserman statistic that's often cited, the 65% of high potential startups fail due to co-founder conflict. That actually Noam took this from a research study that was done in VC to the investors, not to the founders. And it was done in 1989. And so there's both methodological questions and, again, like the generalizability of how much of this is actually relevant today. And so it's complete. This is part of why I appreciate the conversation. I really want to bring more attention to this relationship because if it is, and I think it is, the most important relationship in business, why are we not putting more resourcing and studies behind it to better understand what's actually happening here and how to support founders?
Well, I think it's I think part of it, if I have to look at like how I know academia works, is it goes really, really siloed and really, really deep. Right. So you don't get a lot of psychologists or organizational psychologists go, you know what, I really want to study like co-founders. You'd probably get that. It'd be in the business department. And then you'd have to be like organizational leadership kind of professor. But then you're an MBA, probably a PhD in business. So you don't really have the skills to look at it like an organizational psychologist would. So I think it's a symptom of the siloed nature of academia.
That's a great point.
It takes a little bit of crossover.
Yeah, let's tear that down.
I had a good one, but let's take the next one. Biggest surprise in writing The Co-Founder Effect, and I'm writing a book too, so I'd love to get like just some advice. Both like what you were surprised. This is your first book, right?
My first real book, for sure.
Yeah. So yeah, just unload on me here. Give me some advice on writing my first book.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we'd love to talk.
Yeah. What did you find surprising? What would you do differently? All that stuff.
I have a good lesson for that. So most surprising is that I wrote it. So I didn't plan on writing it at all. I had a friend who's kind of a really famous ghostwriter. So my plan was to take all of my outline material and just give it to him. So I worked on this outline for a year and a half, and he was like, Matt, way too swamped, have too many other projects, can't do this. And I was like, wait, what? So I freaked out. I ended up hiring a fantastic developmental writer, editor, who's reviewed all of my work, gave me feedback, and was like, Matt, this is good. Like, just switch it around. And like, she helped me from a structural lens, took it from an outline to an actual book. And that was immensely valuable. And I think it actually helped me.
So is it helpful to have the whole book basically outlined, like all the way down to, sub bullets, points, just every point you want to make in just indented outline form before you actually put pen to paper?
It depends. I think it depends on you as a writer. I think for me, the answer is yes, having like an overall vision is helpful. In this case, it was not. It was a clusterfuck. The materials were all over. It was disorganized. And that's why I needed this editor's help, because she's like, Matt, no, good stuff is here. We just really need to rework the order and sequencing of it. And so, to that point, the good news is about, and I'd love to introduce you to my editor. She's fantastic. But if that's something you're interested in, the thing that's really cool is you can work with people like this, even if you're very early and you don't have that entire outline. They can help you think through the different parts. But yeah, so that was surprising to me. The other thing, to your point about lessons, I used the word a second ago, but it is sequencing. What I did was I wrote this outline and then had to take it to somebody to help me sort it out. And then I spent all these months rewriting it. And then now I'm kind of in the publishing phase. What I realized though is along the way, as I was waiting for draft feedback, etc., I would try to do various other tasks that I knew would be coming up, like getting the ISBNs, like making marketing materials, whatever the case may be. But what I didn't realize was how much editing would happen at the very, very end as I was like getting into interior formatting and stuff, where I would like look at the actual page and be like, oh, this doesn't look right. I need to rework this sentence. And so what happened was all these different late iterations and edits meant that all of the previous work I did was no longer updated. None of it mattered. Throw out the marketing materials, etc. And so to me, the thing that I learned the most, the biggest takeaway on my end, is sequencing matters. So don't try to do it all at once. Just focus on one thing at a time, in my case.
Interesting. Anything else you'd do differently?
Not yet. I mean, the thing is, there's some Amazon KDP backend stuff that was a little bit weird that I've learned more recently, and some really fun things I'd love to say about the book publishing industry that I didn't know. But for me, it's not about doing something different. It's just, I want to do more. I want to write more books.
Oh, cool. Oh, that's good to know. There's kind of a phrase that floats around the internet. Maybe it's a meme, but everyone should be in therapy. Do you agree with that?
Most therapists suck. Okay. And I say that, and I'm not trying to be a dick, and I'm not trying to like, it's funny. It's not funny. It's like, it's not funny because I'm part of the profession, but like we look at the bell curve, that average in therapy right now is not good. It's really not good because there's some therapists who are trained from academic psychologists who have never actually been with clients. And those people think that our job is to validate and give people CBT worksheets. And that is not therapy according to the way that I have been trained. So I think that's garbage. That's BS. That should be replaced by AI. I think there's a subset of well-qualified therapists who do deep, meaningful, transformative level work that if every person could connect to them, it would be fantastic. The problem is a lot of those people in the US don't take insurance. And so there's a lot of different systemic level issues that impact the answer to this question, where I'd say, yes, therapy can be beneficial for most people if they have a good therapist. The problem is having a good therapist that you can afford and that you can find who's available.
Yeah. And then so the follow-up question is, should every founder pair or founding team have like someone like you coaching them or advising them or giving them, a therapy, giving them tools to improve their interpersonal skills, or should they wait until there's some cracks?
Love this question. I think best practice would be to do both ends. I think doing some preventative work. I have some colleagues, by the way, who specialize in helping early stage teams have some of those crucial conversations that they're probably overlooking and get a really solid foundation in place before there's any issue. And I think that's fantastic.
Yeah, more on the coaching spectrum of things. Like here are interpersonal skills, and before things like really fly off the rails emotionally, right?
100%. And so developing that good hygiene early is best practice. And I think every team should invest in that. At worst, it's like an insurance policy that you won't have to use. At best, it's going to add some skills and prevent those cracks from forming. Where I come into play is a little bit more of the cracks are there and we're ready to work on it. And so I think that works beneficial too. My preference is that we do more on the preventative side.
Interesting. And so do you work on both sides? You kind of work on the preventative side and hey, we're going to probably shut this company down because we don't get along kind of side of things?
Okay, well, what you just said is even later. I would let's not ever let it get to that point.
Yeah.
Please come see me before that. So it's more of, hey, I noticed that there's some emotional residue building up for me. There's some conversations that we're not having, or I don't know that we can have, and maybe I've tried to raise it and the other person wasn't receptive to it. So that's whenever I can be really helpful in figuring out what's going on and helping teams debug and realign. I don't love whenever teams wait until they're on their very last thread and then they come into my office and like, should we end this thing? And I'm like, you guys already did. You're just looking for my permission. And that sucks. I hate that because again, that could have been prevented had they come in with those early signs.
Should every VC make or pay for their founders to have that preventative maintenance coaching?
It's a good question and a challenging one. I think I see a couple benefits and a couple issues. The benefits are, yes, I think that would increase the probability of people engaging, and that could be really beneficial. And I think there's a lot of talk of being like pro founder mental health, but to your point, perhaps not actually being that pro founder mental health to where there's funding. And so I think it could be really beneficial for a lot of reasons for the founders. Where it gets a little complex is in that relationship between myself and the fund, where if there's a direct relationship, sometimes there would be concerns on the founder's part that it's not fully confidential. And so then it's actually more of like, I notice more hesitancy, less vulnerability. And those are actually elements that are required to do meaningful work. So I think in the right model, absolutely, that something like this could be really, really effective, but there should be some thoughtfulness in the design.
Yeah, love that. Is there a founder you'd love to coach, living or dead?
Since I'm a co-founder coach, I think I lean, and this is stereotypical, but I'd love to explain it. I think Jobs and Wozniak would be fascinating. And I'll tell you why. I think one, they're kind of like archetypal personalities where they're just potent and like such a vibe that everyone kind of recognizes them. And I think they would be really challenging to deal with personally. I think that it would bring up a lot of stuff for me, and I would actually have to like show up on, game face on, ready to go. And it would challenge me to grow as a professional in a way that'd be really rewarding. And I think I would be really curious to see how we could have improved the ending, because I think that there's opportunity that was a little bit left untapped toward the end that I would love to talk through and see if we could realign.
Yeah, awesome. Well, for any founder listening out there, how do they get in touch with you?
Yeah, you can find me on LinkedIn, or the main website's probably the best approach, which is cofounderclarity.com.
Great. Thank you so much for coming on, Matt. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Brian. Likewise.